And now, everything you ever wanted to know about the ecstatic state and may have been afraid to ask. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. The ecstatic state is a term that many modern heathen and pagan practitioners may have seen or encountered in one way or another. The ecstatic state is a largely modern framework for understanding altered states of consciousness, and particularly how to deliberately and actively enter a controlled altered state of consciousness. The ecstatic state is frequently used in fire and ice practice as part of solitary mystical workings, in some forms of group ritual practice, and frequently as part of personal practice. The use of the ecstatic state in fire and ice practice draws justification from two related foundations. The first is historical, namely inspired adaptation of documented cases of things like berserkers, the workings of the vulva, seers who channeled the voices of those from beyond, sitting on mounds, ritualistic dancing, and all these other practices hint to different forms of altered states of consciousness being part of pre-Christian Nordic spiritual practice. Though we do not have the specific internal details of how this was done, written from a perspective of a pre-Christian practitioner that survives to the present day, we do have concepts like the ecstatic state that can be used for developing similar practices that draw their origins from these different pre-Christian practices. The second main reason for employing altered states of consciousness and ecstatic practices in fire and ice heathenry is these practices can help the practitioner shift their thinking and their perspectives, consider our relationships with the world around us in different terms, and to inspire creativity and fresh inspiration. What I'm going to do with this podcast is introduce some core concepts for understanding how one can reach altered states of consciousness and work with the ecstatic state. This terminology is based on my own experiences and observations and lots of extended conversation with folks like Sophia and with a lot of people in reclaiming and other similar practices. So, this is kind of an amalgamation of a lot of things that come from lived experience more than necessarily stuff that is in historical sources. And that's okay. What I'm sharing is what I've found works. I also go into this material in classes that I teach on ecstatic related practices like Udisetta, In the Way of Fire and Ice, and in my upcoming book, Spinning Weird, as well as on my website on blackwings.com. This will build on all of that, as well as present it in a different format that folks may find more accessible and more helpful for developing their practice. I'm going to start with describing the concept of processes in ecstatic practice, before then continuing with the triggers, which are two related tools that I find very helpful for developing and maintaining a controlled ecstatic state. Next, I will get into orientation, which refers to, broadly speaking, what focus, what kind of direction is this ecstatic state going, and this can help you develop what kind of processes and triggers you use, as well as how you approach that kind of trance. By the way, I am also going to be using the term trance somewhat interchangeably as we go because it is a similar related concept, and for the purposes of this podcast, can be used more or less interchangeably. Next, I will get into how you can put these different tools and concepts together into a cohesive whole, before finally just sort of summing everything up and bringing everything back together. Before I jump in, I would like to just sort of give the brief obligatory shameless plug for my Patreon. It pays for the server bills that keep this podcast online. It helps pay for keeping my website up, and the more that folks give, the more I'll be able to do and make for not just my patrons, but also generally as just a regular content creator. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes and more benefits as everything grows. So, to get things started, I'm going to jump into this concept I've referred to earlier as processes. Now, a process in the context of the ecstatic state and ecstatic practice is any set of specific actions that are taken in a specific sequence as part of preparation for entering an ecstatic state. If this sounds a lot like ritual, this is because ritual is, in its own way, a form of process and an applied example of processes in spiritual practice. Now, all of that kind of says what a process is. And one example of a process could be, as part of your daily meditative practice, you go into your room, you close the door, you draw the curtains, and you put on a specific kind of music. It could be a specific artist, or even a particular song, or even a chant or poem that you have written specifically for this purpose. All of that, taken in that particular order, is a process. Now, I'm sure at this point you're wondering, why is this important? Why are these kind of ritualized sequences useful for reaching the ecstatic state? The answer is because ritual, process, and repetition activates and interfaces with the brain in a very particular way. To put things in the simplest terms possible, a good way to think of what process does is it's a way of convincing the more conscious, linear, logical parts of your thought process that what you are about to do is logical, makes sense, and will be the result of specific prior actions that have clear, discernible consequences. What you are doing when you use any particular process is you are communicating to yourself, as well as the other people participating in that process, that you are now entering a particular state in preparation for or as part of doing something. This is not something that is unique to the ecstatic practice, by the way. Ritual, sequence, all that stuff has places in very secular contexts in modern society. One great secular example would be a school graduation. Regardless of whether the school is a secular public school, a religious private school, or anything in between, there's generally specific processes and things that are done as part of the whole, recognizing that you have completed your education at this institution, where frequently you'll have things like you bring together the graduates to be in a shared space. It could be a special hall, or usually, if you're talking like, say, public school in the United States, it's probably the football field. You all have to wear a special gown for the occasion. It even includes like a little hat with a tassel, and you're supposed to turn the tassel over, and at least when you're talking an American graduation, when it's finally done and official. And then there's of course like big speeches that are given by sometimes people who went there before, the head of the institution, stuff like that. Finally, they have the graduates line up, step up, give them the symbolic diploma, because the real one's going to show up later in the mail or something. and say their name, and then they get to walk across the stage, and behold, they have graduated. The education that they have undergone is now completed, and we, as a society, hereby recognize this person as having attained that level of education. Now, this is all stuff that's very mundane. The graduation is not the thing that actually gave the knowledge and skills and everything that comes with attaining specific degrees of education, but it is still seen as an important part of the process, as sort of a confirmation that everything has been completed. Now, this is not an ecstatic ritual in any way. However, it nonetheless kind of illustrates the point that I'm getting at of what processes and rituals and stuff do in this instance is they confirm and affirm specific social status and recognition. Most importantly, for the purposes of understanding the ecstatic state, it confers confirmation of shifting how you think about yourself and how you perceive yourself in society and in relation to different kinds of information, qualifications, and what have you. Process and ritual, in the case of the ecstatic state, does something similar. It confirms to the parts of your mind that want a nice, clear explanation for what's happening that this shift in consciousness is a desired outcome. It is an outcome that is the result of a discernible pattern, and therefore, this is something to go along with and accept. Specific kinds of processes and specific rituals can also be used to help reinforce specific uses of the ecstatic state, such as, for example, bringing out model skeletons, pictures of ancestors, or other accoutrements that you associate with death as you begin a meditation oriented towards communing with the dead. Or, for another example, you could have a specific process that you use when you are doing ecstatic workings that bring you in touch with the spirits of a particular place, such as, for example, beginning by whispering words of thanks to a specific tree, giving a small offering of water or something similar, and asking permission to proceed. Such an instance would be signaling to your more conscious and materially grounded parts of your mind that you are seeking to commune with this particular tree and the space around it, and to consider what it represents. And also, of course, it's always good to be asking for consent from different powers before you begin working with them. Processes can be as simple or elaborate as you like. What matters is that they work for you and the conditions that you are operating in. This is a big part of why I emphasize meditation-based ecstatic processes in my books, classes, and writings on Black Wings. Meditative practice, with some adaptation and adjustment depending on how it is you experience a meditative state, is fairly adaptable and can be used as a solid base under the broadest possible range of circumstances while being utilized by the broadest possible range of people. That said, you may find other forms of ecstatic process, like specific dances or chanting or highly specific and organized rituals, are what are more effective for getting you to where it is you want to be. You may find that the processes that are most effective for you change over time and shift depending on how you understand yourself and life experiences that you have as your practice unfolds. Triggers are another useful and powerful tool. A trigger in the context of ecstatic working is a specific sensory experience or thing that you incorporate into your ecstatic process that has associations with specific ecstatic states, specific workings, and specific aspects of your practice. Triggers work in a similar fashion to processes in that what they do is they provide another explanation and affirmation for your more sort of linear, logical part of the mind to accept what is happening and accept that you are entering an altered state of consciousness. Just as processes give a specific linear and logical pattern for the mind to follow and sort of lull it into accepting an altered state of consciousness, triggers are the extra reinforcement of saying, and now I light this incense and this particular smell reinforces my associations of this ritual with the dead, or I pour this water over my hands and through my fingers as I offer it up to the tree, giving sort of the touch feeling of closeness to the water and the land. Or I play this particular track when I do Udisetta meditations, and that helps my mind ease itself into a more relaxed state. The reason why this works is because a sense memory association engages the brain in a much deeper level than a simple information-based association. Creating an association between a specific sense and a specific action, as well as specific process, reinforces the experience and its validity in multiple different parts of the brain. Through repetition, it becomes much more strongly connected with that particular experience and entering that kind of altered state. It's not hard to find examples of these kind of sense memory ritualistic associations coming up in multiple different spiritual contexts. The phrase smells and bells, often used for describing things like high church Anglican practice in the United Kingdom and other similar kinds of more high church forms of Christian practice, neatly encapsulates what I mean by sense memory, where incense will be used as part of sanctifying the space, specific ringings of bells and choral performances will be performed on specific holidays, stuff like that. Like, it's part of reinforcing that sense memory. How you do that in modern heathen practice entirely depends on what works best for you. But things like drumming, singing specific chants in Nordic poetic verse, meditations that use Nordic-derived imagery, and other similar practices are triggers that you can incorporate into your own ecstatic practice. This may mean that there are some triggers that you can't always use and may be very dependent on being in certain circumstances. That's okay. What matters is that the triggers you use work well with your existing processes, complement them, and help reinforce the altered state. The next set of tools I'm going to get into is what I refer to as orientation. And this is orientation in the sense of orienting yourself in terms of space and relationship to other objects in space, but as applied for describing the ecstatic state, or rather, specific ecstatic states. As you've probably gathered by now, not all ecstatic states are the same, and different ecstatic states can be achieved for reaching different goals, inspiring different experiences, or in other ways interacting with different sets of perspectives and assumptions. Orientation is what helps differentiate between these different kinds of ecstatic practices and these different states, while also describing how one gets there, depending, of course, on what kind of ecstatic state or trance experience that you are looking for and engaging in. I describe orientation as existing on two different axes, with each one representing a spectrum of different experiences. And these are up versus down and in versus out. Up and down refers to how you enter the ecstatic state. An up-oriented ecstatic state or trance is achieved through especially intense interaction with the environment around you, with your physical self, and with other people in space. So, for example, ritualistic dancing. Moshing could be seen as a way of getting into an up trance, as could other examples of, you could say, more waking forms of ecstatic practice that share an emphasis on interacting with your environment in specific ways. Up trances are ones that you could see as almost launching yourself up and outward into a greater awareness of the world around you, or of yourself and how you move within the world. All, of course, depending on what it is you're trying to do. A downward-oriented ecstatic state is the opposite, where an upward-oriented ecstatic state depends heavily on specific, intense forms of sensory engagement and interaction. A downward trance instead focuses on reducing sensory inputs and interactions with the world around you. Most downward-oriented ecstatic states employ meditative techniques in some way or another, though not necessarily all. What a downward-oriented trance does that is different from an upward-oriented one is it brings you into the altered state by actively shifting your consciousness away from your surroundings and into a different space and a different set of sensory inputs. Both methods are equally valid for any range of experiences, processes, mystical practices, and however else you want to go about your ecstatic practice. If up versus down refers to how you get into the ecstatic state, then in versus out defines what it is you are going to be doing within that ecstatic state. Generally speaking, an inward-focused ecstatic state is oriented around resolving concerns, finding inspiration, or looking for insights on matters of the self. This can be things like wrestling with specific anxieties through altered states, interacting with the different parts of the self under the Nordic 4-part self model, or any number of other things that are focused on you and things that are often deeply personal matters and are happening within you and as part of you and you moving through your life in the world. This includes ecstatic states that are focused on bringing about self-change and self-transformation. An outward-oriented ecstatic state, by contrast, is any kind of ecstatic state where you are interacting with things beyond you, things that are not matters of the self and of the person, but are things like interacting with other powers, journeying to the other worlds, getting information about the world around you, doing different forms of divination for seeking answers to larger questions of things like, what is going to be my next source of income? Or what do I need to do to get through this program? Or help, I need some sense of direction in the midst of everything is sort of falling apart and the world is looking a bit apocalyptic right now. Working with powers would include things like reaching out to and contacting gods, along with other powers at other levels of influence and location within the 9 worlds and Nordic practice. How you put these together is what brings you the full orientation of a specific ecstatic state. So, for example, the way I prefer to teach Udisetta in my books and classes is as a down and out form of trance, where you use meditation as the core process in conjunction with other specific triggers and processes to bring your body and self into a rested state that allows for you to then enter an altered state that makes you more open to information from outside of you, such as sitting out on a grave mound, entering weird in search of information, journeying into the other worlds, and all kinds of other related similar practices. You could just as easily do something like Udisetta as an up and out oriented trance, where you use things like ecstatic dance and movement to bring yourself into the altered state that allows you to move your awareness out and beyond yourself. There's also nothing that says specific orientations have to go in specific combinations. It is perfectly possible and has been done within practice for folks to have ecstatic states that could be described as up and in or up and out, as well as down and in and down and out. What is important when you're talking about orientation is thinking about what you are trying to do with your ecstatic state and how that best works with your specific practices, processes, triggers, and other associations around what it is you're doing. One person may find that upward-oriented trance is what is best for them to work with the deceased and the departed. As, activities that are associated with more upward-oriented trances can help break down the sense of separation between us and the world around us, and through that break down that separation between the living and the dead. Just as much as you may find that a downward-oriented trance is more appropriate for entering a sort of state of repose and contemplation that evokes the stillness of death and the grave. For another example, you may find when working with, say, your Philgia, which is one of the parts of the self that is used in specific forms of Nordic mysticism, that you best reach that relationship with them through putting on, like, say, a particular skin or cloak that reminds you of your Philgia's form. And then with that, moving as the Philgia does and trying to get that feeling of a specific animal or maybe human-like motions that you associate with your Philgia, just as much as you can use meditative sessions as a way of shifting your focus to be more receptive to the Philgia as a part of you. Even though there are ways that I particularly teach these particular forms of mystical practice, doesn't mean that's the only way that it has to be done. Udisetta, part of what makes working through this sort of exciting and interesting is there's a broad range for how you can reach ecstatic and altered states, different tools, different techniques, and different methods that you can utilize. I think that there is a broad set of possibilities suggested in surviving source material and archaeology, also provides further fuel and justification for experimentation, exploration, and the creation of new ways and new methods that feel most appropriate to the people who are using them. And this is something that you will see as you integrate processes, triggers, and orientation into how you approach ecstatic practice. Associating specific processes and specific triggers with specific uses will strengthen those associations and sort of create this feedback loop of where sort of the more you do particular ritual in an ecstatic form in a particular way, the stronger and more resonant that ritual becomes. For example, to go back to the death ritual that I've been alluding to throughout this episode, you may find that playing music from a specific artist as you enter the room where you keep your shrine and pull out accoutrements that you associate with the dead, that these processes and these triggers become more and more associated with your relationship with the dead and working with the departed and what they represent for you. As you practice and reinforce this association, it becomes easier and smoother and quicker to enter these altered states. This is reinforced when you develop other specialized sets of processes and triggers for specific sets of practice. The more you reinforce that this sequence, this artist, and this incense is for the dead, and this sequence, this song, this dance is what I do for honoring the spirits of this particular place, the more resonant those particular processes become in and of themselves. Because not only do your specific triggers, processes, and orientations around a specific practice reinforce themselves the more you do them, having other related sets of practices that you also do and reinforce each other. Because what it creates is this sort of underlying logic, this set of permissions and assumptions that says generally that when I am doing these things that I associate with altered states of consciousness, it opens the way for me to shift my consciousness, to shift my perspectives, and shift how I understand reality. It is a thing that is reliable and consistent, and has been applied in multiple different ways. So, of course, in this specific way, for, again, going back to the dead example, by doing this ritual in this place, I will reinforce the sense that when I do similar practices for things like working with local land spirits, that it will have that result. It is creating these sets of feedback loops of mutually reinforcing and supporting cycles through practice, through consistent use of specific processes, triggers, and orientations, that you create this sort of new way of approaching practice and approaching the world around you. That's also why it's very important as you're integrating these different elements into different aspects of your practice to be mindful of what you see and what you specifically associate with altered states of consciousness. You may find, and this actually is the case with some folks, that the more practiced you get, the easier it is for you to slip into an ecstatic state, even possibly without realizing it or controlling it. There are some people who I've worked with who have something of a natural gift for shifting consciousness, and their challenge is not so much getting there and coaxing the mind to accept this break from accepted reality and material conditions. It's tethering yourself back to reality and being able to pull yourself back from the altered state in a controlled and safe fashion. The best way to do this is to include in your practice specific processes and triggers that are associated with bringing yourself out of an altered state of consciousness. This can be things like sequences of actions that you take during a meditative trance, changing and slowing down the rhythm of a set of ritualistic motions and chanting, playing a specific song, or even using a specific type of breathing and movement to bring yourself out of an altered state. Think of this as sort of like your landing sequence for coming down from having flown through the skies of an altered state. And these are sequences that can, if necessary, be used in something of a sort of emergency brake, crash landing kind of way. This is, of course, not recommended, but you may find yourself in ecstatic states where you need to immediately pull yourself out as quickly and safely as possible. One thing I'd also like to talk briefly about is the use of psychoactive substances. Now, legally speaking, always check what the local laws are for wherever it is that you are practicing. Local conditions may vary. There are lots of different things that count as psychoactive substances. People most commonly think of things like hallucinogens as things like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms and stuff like that as sort of the go-to of when people are thinking, oh, that's a kind of substance that I would see somebody using in ritual space. Though this is certainly not the only option that's out there. I mean, arguably some more boozy forms of the bloat right could be seen as using the psychoactive substance known as alcohol to bring people into a particular kind of altered state. Regardless, what I think is important to keep in mind is when you are first starting out in developing your practice, that you use methods that rely the least that you possibly can on different psychoactive substances. Ideally, if you are starting out or renewing your practice in ecstatic work, you should be refraining from using particular substances at all while you are engaging in deliberate ecstatic work. This is so that you do not develop a dependence on using those substances as a means for entering or leaving an ecstatic state. And I also want to emphasize, it's totally possible to enter an ecstatic state without any use of substances whatsoever. In fact, that it is possible and repeatable without the use of such substances is one of the most beautiful things about the ecstatic state. That it is something that seems to be attainable as part of the human experience generally. Now, whether or not you want to use substances as part of your practice is a personal choice. What I recommend, particularly for people who are starting out with ecstatic work, is not to mix these things together. You are also should not feel pressured or required to imbibe any particular substance that you don't want to use as part of ritual. Part of bodily autonomy and developing healthy practice is knowing what your boundaries are and what you feel safe with. If you are in an environment where you are feeling pressured to do so, or worst case scenario, and there's a thing that has happened in a couple of instances, Wisdom of Odin being one of the most notorious examples, of people being unknowingly dosed or otherwise drugged at different ritual or pagan events. If you start feeling like your sense of perception and awareness is shifting in a way that you would associate with some kind of substance, you should try to get to safety and as soon as you are able. It should go without saying that any group that's willing to dose people without their consent is a gigantic red flag, regardless of any other factors. So anyway, to close everything out and bring everything back together, the ecstatic state is a kind of altered state of consciousness that can be reached through the use of specific practices and methods that every individual can develop and different groups can develop based on what works best for them and is most effective for them. These kinds of practices can be described as processes, which are specific rituals and sequences of actions that are used to give the conscious mind permission to enter an altered state. Triggers, specific sensory associations and sense memories, such as sights, smells, and sounds that have particular associations with ecstatic states and ecstatic practices, and orientations, which help you determine what sets of processes and triggers are going to be most effective for achieving the particular state that you are aiming for. These tools give you the means to develop your own specific ecstatic states for specific purposes and uses, and they give you the means to establish boundaries and maintain safety while you are in these states. How you use ecstatic practice and ecstatic states in your practice is entirely up to you, as are the ways that you integrate these particular skills, how you develop your processes, your trigger associations, and determine how you orient your particular ecstatic states. Developing these practices, reinforcing them, and engaging with them makes them more effective for you and also gives you more confidence in developing your personal spiritual practice. As always, whenever you're doing ecstatic practice, either alone or with a group, safety and consent should always be guiding principles and used for establishing clear boundaries respected by all who are involved. Ecstatic work and altered states work is also not a replacement for doing things like regularly going to therapy and seeking the assistance of medical professionals and mental health practitioners. However, it can be extremely useful, fulfilling, and validating for both your practice and for yourself. So, this has been my further discussion of the ecstatic state and ecstatic practice. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and find this episode helpful for developing your practice. If you would like to help support the work that I do and the content that I produce, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you all the benefits and helps build support for me making more anti-fascist heathen content, doing more heathen organizing, and making fascists deeply uncomfortable. So thank you all again for listening. Again, this podcast is possible because of my patrons and the support they give. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off.